Now I will talk about refugees. This is part 4 of the book chapter, African Immigrant Philanthropy in New York City. So exiles, African exiles who reside in the United States include some very prominent scholars, some of whom have become a fixture in the US Academy. Ngugi wa Thiong'o of Kenya was at that time a professor at New York University. I think he went on to University of California, one of the campuses or branches. Wole Soyinka, Nigeria's Nobel Prize laureate, was also in exile during the period of the Abacha regime. During the apartheid era, many South African scholars and students were resident in the United States as exiles. Their activities in raising consciousness and developing public awareness of the plight of Black South Africans contributed immensely to giving a human face to the anti-apartheid movement. It also contributed to the strengthening of the US anti-apartheid movements and United Nations initiatives to bring the weight of the world's public opinion to bear on the apartheid regime. Many of the anti-apartheid groups established in the United States by various South African exiles were philanthropic as well as political. Members provided one another with mutual support, information, and a variety of individual and collective assistant efforts. The documentation of such efforts is ongoing. With the level of political upheaval in many African countries, it is to be expected that more exiles would increasingly seek political asylum in the United States. The most likely countries at the time, 2004, from which these population movements might come include Sudan, which remains a country in conflict today, Liberia, Sierra Leone. Both of those were at that time involved in very serious and costly civil wars. Others are the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which today is still in conflict. Cote d'Ivoire was at the time in conflict, so was Zimbabwe. Ethiopia was in conflict then, and there's conflict in parts of Ethiopia today. Eritrea, the same. Rwanda and Burundi at the time were heavily involved in conflict. And Kenya at the time had exiles, people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Michere Mugo, and so on. As these exiles settle into their new communities, it is to be expected that they will build networks and institutions that both support them and provide philanthropic services for the exiles, as well as to those left behind in the home countries. In the workplace, it is not unusual for the recent African immigrant to face animosity from native-born African Americans who consider the immigrant as taking jobs that ought to belong to African Americans. Some school teachers and university professors are also faced with students who claim not to understand their accents, and colleagues and supervisors that suggest accent-altering classes. Many such individuals use the organizations that they belong to within the African immigrant communities as a resource base from which they get informal counseling and support, as well as advice on how to assess such issues and the consequent anger and/or insecurity that is experienced. The counseling and support received is often within the context of conversations with others at weekly meetings, parties, religious worship, and social events. Much of it is informal, and it depends on an individual asking for and receiving help from people that they are most familiar with and trust. Within the four categories of immigrant, migrant, exile, and refugee, one can further identify some groups based on gender, socioeconomic class, age, religion, linguistic differences, and interest groups. These categories are even more interesting when considered as cross-cutting each other in multiple dialectical interactions. By this, I mean that a refugee, for instance, may be male, female, or other, child, adult, youth, elderly, poor, middle class, wealthy, belong to a pressure group or community-based organization of Africans from one of the various regions of the continent, or Africans from one of 54 countries, or Africans from one of thousands of ethnicities, or Africans from one of several thousand kinship groups or lineages. Such a person may be Christian, and there are various denominations, of which one can find the following: Lutheran, Baptist, Catholic, Methodist, Presbyterian, Pentecostal, Aladura, Coptic, Ethiopian Orthodox, and so on and so forth. Or they could be Muslim from one of several paths established to worship God through the Prophet Muhammad. Or the individual may well be a believer in any one of the multitude of African traditional religions. These dialectical interactions mean that a holistic perspective cannot be taken towards issues related, homogeneous perspective cannot be taken towards issues related to African immigrant analysis across the board. Matters are further complicated by the immigrant Africans' relative newness to the American socio-political and economic systems, and they come into an environment where Pan-Africanism resonates more profoundly than nationalism. There's also the further complication of lacking a voice that is clearly identifiable, because an African could well be an African American whose family has been in the United States since the 17th century, or someone who just landed yesterday, fresh from the African continent. This being said, what philanthropic issues are thrown up by an inquiry into the circumstances of African immigrant communities? We must consider a further distinction between documented and undocumented aliens. The number of African immigrants is minuscule when compared with that of other immigrant communities, but it is no exaggeration to claim that undocumented immigrants are grossly undercounted. Among undocumented Francophone immigrants interviewed in the New York City area, one paramount issue is what most of them call, quote unquote, papers. Many are hardworking and even entrepreneurial. Some have established a deep and profoundly wide-ranging presence in the economy. However, they may lack legal authorization to live in the United States. For these immigrants, support for amnesty for all immigrants would be a #1 priority issue. The group most threatened by the presence of African immigrants, be they documented or undocumented aliens, are African Americans. Many African Americans believe documented African immigrants unjustifiably benefit from affirmative action policies for which they did not struggle, and the historical underpinnings of which they either choose or refuse to understand. Many Africans indeed take the negative media portrayal of African Americans as unbiased truth, and they fail to recognize the long-term negative repercussions of racism, bias, and institutionalized injustice. Since the historical construction of Blackness is the very antithesis of the purity of whiteness, most Africans tend to instinctively distance themselves from the stigma by claiming to be African and not Black. This complicates matters immensely because African Americans also claim to be African. This is a testament to the relevance of the concept of intra-racial ethnicity, developed by Irma Watkins Owens. And she has a really wonderful book titled Blood Relations, has subtitles, which I'm going to skip now. It's in the references. Her conceptualization was applied specifically to the case of people of African descent from the Caribbean, South America, New York, and other parts of the North, as well as southern region of the United States in the Harlem section of New York City from 1900 to 1930. Despite this, it describes the tensions and potential for cooperation that could and sometimes do exist in such communities today. Historically, immigration also causes a great degree of anxiety among African Americans. So, such anxiety has not been without good reason. Since the rise of immigration as a source of free labor was also tied to the emancipation of enslaved African Americans. Black leaders of the day, including Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, held radically different views on the causes and effects of the United States government's push for recruiting immigrant labor from Europe. However, most agreed that immigration has negative consequences for African Americans in the workplace. Unfortunately, this situation still persists today. Immigrant Blacks may face bias in the workplace, but they are still relatively more privileged than African Americans. It stands to reason, then, that the various communities of Black people remains extremely tense. The relationships between the various communities of Black people remains extremely tense. At the base of such tension is the competition for upward mobility. And in some cases, the need to demonstrate that one or the other community is the quote unquote ideal Black one. Immigrants tend to hold the belief that by hard work, they can show that they're not the stereotypical African American, and thus will be rewarded and embraced. Most African immigrants take negative experiences of race-based stigma as exceptions to the rule. Therefore, the Amadou Diallo case, where an undocumented Guinean young man was mowed down in a hail of 41 gunshots by the members of the Special Task Force of the New York City Police Department in the vestibule of his own apartment building, was especially disturbing to most African immigrants. Other issues that are high on the priority list for most African immigrants is access to affordable and good quality healthcare, access to English language classes for the Francophone, Lusophone, Arabic speaking, and to the population that speaks only one or several languages indigenous to Africa. When African immigrants are new to the United States, they tend to depend on their network of friends and family for advice on how to access these services. Most new immigrants also pay out of pocket for healthcare and tend only to avail themselves to it on an emergency basis. Informal networks provide advisory services in different communities where needed. At the time, in the early 2000s, two Nigerians sought to establish a free medical clinic in the Far Rockaway section of New York City, where there were many African immigrants. This is an area that is a very popular first place of settlement for many immigrant groups, including Africans. As more African immigrants become active in local, state, and national politics, another source of tension may develop. The lines of disagreement are already being drawn, as indicated by disagreements over who should be counted as Black in the 2000 census. This issue continues to bedevil relationships between peoples of African descent in the United States. African American leaders argued at the time that all people of African descent should join the, quote, Black Box campaign, unquote, by only identifying themselves as Black or African American, whether or not they have other ancestry. Most Black immigrants tend to identify as a national of their country of origin. Thus, they claim to be either Jamaican or Senegalese, rather than Black or African American. At the time, for Professor Bolaji Aluko of Howard University, who was the coordinator of the Washington, D.C.-based African Expatriate Caucus, or AEC, the category of African American, Negro, or Black was not sufficiently descriptive of all the people in this group. Statistical data that are provided by the Census Bureau will continue to be unreliable if African immigrants do not identify themselves as such. Doing so would not only give an accurate number of immigrants, it would also enable the immigrants to show their potential, quote, collective political power, unquote. Aluko also states, and I quote, at the end of the day, when you are trying to lobby Congress for a cause, people will ask you about your electoral clout. The benefit is that if they have the numbers on our groups, we can use them to influence policy on foreign affairs and immigration. The discussion has wider ranging implications for people of African descent who also have other points of origin. If they check Black only, as they're encouraged to do by the campaign of that name, where does this leave them in terms of the strongly felt need that they're not part of a homogeneous whole that is fully and accurately described by the categorization Black? This issue was raised by Charles Michael Bird, publisher and editor of the New York-based magazine Interracial Voice, who recognizes the historical basis of the need for the racial categories in the census. The categories may have been an essential factor when Jim Crow laws had to be overturned through positive policy initiatives. For him, this rationale is no longer a necessary one, and thus the policy should be abandoned. Since the census figures are used to determine the service needs of various communities, when people are undercounted, they will also be underserved. The fiscal and economic losses are tremendous. However, for Bird, The economic and fiscal issues should not justify overcounting. The Black community, quote, has been artificially inflated for decades by the numbers of multiracial peoples. If Black numbers decrease, that is where they should be. All the Constitution calls for is simple enumeration of all Americans, not a count based on the pseudoscience of race, which has no biological basis, unquote. The implications of the census issue for philanthropy is that reliable statistics are needed for advocates, government bureaucracies, and philanthropic institutions and organizations in order to plan, disseminate information effectively, and locate services where they are most needed. If indeed people are to be encouraged to quote unquote check Black, cooperation and collaboration among the various communities of people of African descent must also be vigorously pursued, and some power sharing must be undertaken. One of the problems is that it is unlikely for this to happen. Gatekeeping by old power centers within the Black communities would still persist until the cost of maintaining the status quo become unbearable. There are numerous tensions that militate against successful cooperation and collaboration among people of African descent in the United States. These tensions are strengthened by economic concerns among the more established diasporic communities that African immigrants are taking away jobs that ordinarily would go to them. There are also feelings that African immigrants lack an understanding of the deep-rooted and pervasive nature of discrimination in American society. Alternatively, African American and African Caribbean people may feel that Africans try to take advantage of divide and conquer tactics that are deployed by racists, or that they unfairly benefit from affirmative action programs and policies that were achieved at great cost by earlier generations. The problems and tensions among the various communities of people of African descent must be confronted, addressed, and diffused. For the African immigrants, to the extent that New York City is their permanent place of settlement, there ought to be an effort made to study African American history. This is particularly important because many Africans claim not to have studied anything related to something as basic as the history of enslavement of African Americans in their home countries. Knowledge is also crucial in other respects. Access to information about fair wages, labor standards, sources of employment, and adequate benefits are all crucial. Broadening one's social network beyond those from one's home country is essential to gain this knowledge. This, of course, is easier said than done. Many African immigrants not only exclusively socialize with those from their home countries, they only socialize with those from their country that speak their language. Many community-based organizations that have established an institutional presence in the African immigrant community are organized around ethnicity. Other organizing factors include, but are not limited to, professional specialization, religion, and social status. A few examples from the African immigrant community include, but are not limited to, those I will describe in subsequent recording, and I'll just name some of them. The Association of Nigerian Physicians Abroad, Afenifere, Africa Mix, Association of Nigerian Lawyers, African Women's Fund, the Yoruba Alliance. So I will talk about these in part 5 of this paper. Thank you.